Professor Tai Yong. You're the director of the Institute of South Asian Studies, and you're here from Singapore in Sri Lanka for a few days. Thank you very much for joining us on Talking Economics.
Thank you.
Professor, I thought I'll ask you, you and your institute, you're an observer and an analyst on South Asian issues, but from outside the region.
Right.
I thought I'd find out from you what your thoughts are on South Asia, particularly South Asia fitting in this region that is being dynamically led by India, as well as China and East Asia on one side, and also emerging Middle East. Where do you see South Asia fitting into all this?
First, let me explain Singapore's interest in South Asia. I think Singapore, as you know, is a small city-state, and historically it has always pitched its fortunes on becoming a part of regional and global trading networks. Now, historically, you may know that Singapore was founded as a trading station by the East India Company when it was trying to build a kind of a trading network linking India to China. So that was how Singapore came into being as a modern entity. Now, looking forward, currently and looking forward, Singapore wants to also see itself as playing a role in an Asia that is growing, that is thriving. Now, Singapore, together with the so-called tiger economies, have done well for itself from the 1970s to 1980s and beyond. But right now, it needs to see how it can continue to play a part as the Asian economies are driven by giants like India and China. So we are very interested to understand from the Institute's point of view how South Asia can play a part in this growing Asian century. I think the story of China's growth, of South Korea, of Japan is already well known. But less so is known about India and South Asia. So you know that in the last 8-10 years, India has been registering very impressive economic growth since it started liberalizing its economy. It's been growing at 8-9%, and this will have an impact on I think the trajectory of the country's prominence both in Asian affairs and in world affairs. And already one sees it playing a very important role as a very key player in Asian affairs that will involve China, Japan and America. Now, what about the region? Now, one of the issues that we have to come to terms with is that India is in an interesting neighborhood called South Asia, and it is surrounded by several countries that have all got its interesting trajectories and stories. So we are also interested to understand the region beyond India and see how it has an impact on not only on India's performance but also on its relations with the rest of Asia and Southeast Asia in particular. So we are interested to look at Pakistan-India relations, we are interested to look at Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, but not just in terms of its relations with India but also on their own terms, because they are significant players in themselves. Taken together, of course, the South Asian population is a large one. But each of these countries have their own share of history and very interesting developments, and there are of course ups and downs, but of late we are seeing countries like Sri Lanka, for instance, emerging out of civil war and now taking on a new trajectory. And how we see the trajectory is something that we are very interested in understanding. Then there is Bangladesh, of course, some period of stability now, and it's getting its manufacturing economy into place. People are saying it's likely to be the second manufacturing base outside of China in terms of volume and importance. So one sees opportunities here and there. And then of course Pakistan has its share of issues which we also need to understand. Now, all said and done, for good or for worse, I think South Asia has a very important role to play in the future of Asia. So in terms of economic growth, economic trajectory, in terms of trade, India within the region and with China, with Southeast Asia, with the West will play a very important part. Likewise, when things start moving right for, say, countries like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, both in terms of manufacturing, exports, in terms of trade, they will also start playing an important part in connecting South Asia and Southeast Asia. And perhaps even with the West. So these are some of the things that drive our interest in understanding more of South Asia. And we know very little in Singapore. We know a lot more about China, we know something about Japan and South Korea, but I think we need to know more about South Asia.
Professor, you said you know quite a bit of what's happening in China. There's at the World Bank IMF spring meetings last week, there was this session on Asia's rebalancing, and much of the discussion was on how much of a role China will play in taking the world out of recession, but in the context of China's slightly waning economic performance.
Right.
Some attributed it to the cyclical factors, weaknesses in their external markets, but many also said that there are structural issues in China that are going to hold it back, and now is the time for some of those structural issues to be addressed. Which side of the argument do you agree with, and if you could elaborate on your thoughts on what China's growing pains are, as it were?
Well, I'm not an expert on China, but what I can do is share some thoughts about what I think are some of the issues. Of course, there are lots of excitement about China. Everybody is impressed with the way it's moved the last 20 years. I think, as I said, in its demonstration of its prominence in world affairs is very evident in a number of areas now, from international trade to environment to even games and sports and Olympics. But China has its share of issues which it needs to sort out, some of which is quite structural. I think one is the kind of a disparity in terms of its development geographically between the coastal areas that all seem to be thriving and the interior that are still in need of lots of development. So unless this disparity is being addressed and quickly, you might have a polarization, and that might lead to problems. And that's number one. Number two, I think it's the domestic consumption, the domestic demand. I think the economy has been driven by exports largely. This is fine when people continue to buy Chinese goods. But with Europe in the situation that it is, America and others being perhaps a little bit more protectionist going forward, now it will have an impact on its exports. And when China's exports start to slow down, and if its own domestic consumption doesn't ramp up, then you're going to have an economic issue. And at the end of the day, it is still a one-party political system, and the legitimacy of the Communist Party, I think, is derived from its ability to continue to sustain economic growth. That's a state legitimacy, and the only way it's going to do is continue to give people the good livelihood, the promise of economic growth and advancement that it has said it will do. If that slows down, then you're going to see political problems. So these are some of the issues which I think the Chinese leadership will have to think about.
Costs are rising in China.
Yeah.
China is no longer one of the,
Right.
enjoying extremely cheap
Right.
factor costs.
Right.
Particularly labor costs rising on the coast.
Yes.
Do you buy into this idea of a China spill, where countries like Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and Bangladesh could essentially chip away at China's manufacturing prowess, as it were, and really take away the cheap manufacturing away from China as China moves towards maybe slightly higher value, capital intensive manufacturing?
I think you will see that happening. I mean, in terms of producing cheaply and labor cost, I think China is really beginning to see some of these problems, right? I think you see in Guangdong, for instance, Guangdong province, labor unrest, people not happy with the wages they are paid and protesting and even going on strike. So will this spread? And this may spread as people have different expectations of what they should be paid. So you will see this happening, I think, in the more developed parts of China. But of course, China has a surfeit of labor in the interior. So now the question is, how would they sort of redistribute, I think, some of these manufacturing bases? Of course, that does not stop other countries outside of China from using this model to build up their manufacturing sector. Cheap labor, state support, and perhaps cheap land and infrastructure, and that may happen. But I think we have to look at scale here, whether they have the scale to do so, and also I think the kinds of political system that is in place. And China is able to do so because of the way it organizes itself, it organizes its labor, and it's all part of the whole broader political system. And I think it's not easy to duplicate this in totality. But of course, when you have land and cheap labor and some skill training, you can always do that. But I think the question, of course, will be on what scale and at what capacity.